example for this podcast. If you want Jason and me to come out, speak to you at your church, your business, you have a men's event coming up, and you really have found a lot of blessings in this podcast, please reach out to us at thejonathanprojectpodcast at gmail.com. Again, thejonathanprojectpodcast at gmail.com. Jason, welcome back to another episode here. I know it was an interesting couple days for you, especially.
Well, it's interesting days for you too. So I'm going to hijack this moment before I tell you about that debacle. Let's talk about something solid and something really good. Yeah, as you realize right now, you have no mute on my side. Well, maybe you do. I don't know. It's technology. Who knows what you can do? But congratulations, you won the book cover for your books. Was it one award or two?
Well, so this is the
because I voted on two covers.
I know Jason's putting me on the spot here, which he always gives me a hard time for you folks. Listen, I am the worst self-proponent in the history of anybody doing anything. But yeah, so for all that didn't know, I've written a Christian book series that deals with the end times. It takes a look at a little bit of my experiences with supporting some people like Jason and just a military kind of take on it. It's a pretty fun read, I think. But the book series has won a couple of awards. I'm gonna have to edit that out, right? For Redemptive Faith is one award. A Christian organization out of Australia gave us that award. That was pretty cool. And just recently, the Authors Show, which is a big radio and online marketing kind of platform for authors, had a book cover contest. And for the Christian fiction genre, my first book in the series, Rapture, Advent of the Last Days, won. So I get to do an interview with them at some point whenever I get the chance to slow down and schedule that. But yeah, thanks for throwing that out there. Yeah.
Well, you're so humble about the book. I wrote a book series. Come on, man. Like that is
I'm the worst, man. That's why I never have 4 stars on my chest, because I can't promote myself.
Look, for everybody out there who has not read this, Colby, that's extremely well researched books. You know, you get right into it. They're great books. They're captivating. I love them all, but the endings where it's just like, boop, somebody cuts the light out, and that's what your dad said. I thought he captured it very well.
Yeah.
But I do love them, and so I have to time it until, okay, when's your next one coming out? I'm gonna stop here in the middle or towards 3/4, and then I do it. So congratulations. Also, with that being said, thank you very much for putting on the podcast. For people who don't know, this 100% is a technical Animal Planet, and we are both lean probably heavier towards the outside Neanderthal. So I had Tyler called me up and he goes, "Hey, I can't see you." And I'm like, "Well, hey man, we're not FaceTiming. Like, you're calling me. What's the problem? What are you talking about?" And he goes, "No, on your podcast." And I went, "Oh, I don't know how that works." And so for those people, for people out there that were listening to us on Spotify, we didn't know it wasn't out there.
Yeah, so sorry for all those folks out there. It's fixed now.
It's fixed. Okay. We didn't know a bunch of this stuff wasn't working, but we also juggle that in our regular jobs. And Colby, you do a lot of that, so I want to say thank you very much for that.
It's a team effort. It's all good, man.
Yeah.
So enough about me here. Let's move on to God, or even before we get to that, let's talk about you. What happened with you this weekend?
Let me tell you, man. So, as everybody on this podcast and everybody knows me knows, I drive an old truck. So I had drill. I went down there, and my truck decided instead of cranking to go click, and I figured that was the starter. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, there are not a lot of videos on YouTube about how to change the starter on a Dodge 2500 diesel. And that's because there aren't that many successful people doing it. I may not be technologically inclined, but I'm absolutely mechanically inclined. from growing up and working on cars to get to where I had to go, and then working on them in parking lots to get back to where I
Yeah,
live.
that'll do
Uh,
it. That'll do it.
yeah, it'll do it. You get practice every day. And so I worked on that, but at the same time, my wife goes, "Hey, we got a note from the water department that says we could have a leak." So I
Oh
walk
man.
out to the meter,
Uh,
and it's like Bones Fork. I step in it, and my foot goes down, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" So I dig it out. And, you got to dig out a whole lot, but I turn the water on to see where the leak is. It was
yeah.
pretty evident to find. We dumped a lot of water into that yard. It'll be green for a while, but
Oh man.
I got all that fixed probably about 10 o'clock last night. So for those listening, it is Monday evening instead of Sunday, where we do this in a nice, relaxed atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, man,
It's all good, man.
I tried to text you and like, hey, actually, Michaela was texting you. I was covered in red clay and grease.
No, I felt bad for you, man. Like you were digging up half of Alabama in your front yard there. So I was like, well, you know what? It's not having, and we do this with each other, right? And this is kind of the good thing with men. This is why you got to have Jonathans in your life. You got to have those people that can kind of say, hey, man, like let's take the old tactical pause, take a knee, because it's not good to come into something like this with a mind state where you're all stressed.
Yeah.
As we're doing this after work, right? Kind of funny. But
Yeah.
yeah, yesterday was just not a good day for you, and so it's all
Yeah.
good, man.
No, I appreciate it, especially if we're going to talk about hard conversations. And,
Good
you know,
segue there,
yeah, we're going to have hard conversations. Men are going to have hard conversations. Believe it or not, it's our responsibility.
yeah.
It's not up to the school system to tell our kids about the birds and the bees or to have those types of hard conversations. It's
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
unless I don't know, man, cat litter boxes in public school bathrooms. You can figure all that stuff out. People, whatever. It's weird, right? And then,
Yeah,
yeah,
that is weird.
don't leave that up. Yeah, don't leave that up to the public school system or your kids' friends to teach them things that it's in your responsibility, right? As a
Yeah.
father to do that. So hard conversations, man, Colby. I thought a lot about that, and
Mm,
well, what makes them hard?
yeah.
Um, and because basically it's how do you set the train back on the tracks, right?
Mhm.
So what do you think about, or I'm just going to ask you, why do you think it's hard? Why do you think hard conversations are hard? Right?
I think it's always the dynamic of it's a relationship usually, right? And the fear that you're going to damage the relationship in some way, shape, or form. You're going to lose um, something that you had in that relationship. So I think that's what really makes it hard for people.
Yeah.
But really, we're challenged, and the Bible challenges, and we're going to get into this a little bit later in the show. At least I will, of calling each other to the carpet, if you would.
Yeah.
And there's some really good examples of that. But but it's out of the again, kind of what we talked about last week. You have to have the right heart when you have a conversation with someone, a difficult conversation. Even in parenting, I think about that. Like I had a challenge with my son here recently with, completing the task, aka like why would you turn in your homework when it's only halfway done? Like yeah.
Hey.
So
Yeah.
hard conversation, but it's to bring him back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if any of us have had those kind of things, to bring us back into the right mindset, to the right place. And it was done out
Yeah.
of love. Like, I love you. You need to kind of correct this azimuth that you're on, like halfway
Yeah.
doing stuff. And let's complete the mission, right? But anywho, yeah, I think that's it, the relationship part.
So I did some backwards thinking on this, and I got to a lot of the exact same toll booths you got to, because it's seldom about facts. The reason it's hard is it's about emotions, and those
Yeah.
emotions are either internal or external. Internally, we may have obstacles that we have to overcome to address a problem. And I kind of asked, I'm like, well, why is it hard to talk to people about difficult conversations? And some of those were, some people just don't like people, right? Well, as a Christian, you don't really get that luxury.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? There's plenty of examples where, like Jesus with the woman in the well, right?
Yeah.
And some people are afraid. We talked about that. You said
Yeah.
that, right? And it's difficult to talk to people. Well, I thought about the Bible, and it says, be strong and have courage, meaning you need to take an action. Like
Yeah.
if I looked at you and you go, "Hey, how do I move that weight?" And I go, "Huh, you know what you need to do? You need to pick that weight up." That may not be easy.
Yeah.
So it's going to take an effort. Um, the next thing is also God tells us to love other people as we love ourselves. He was pretty clear on that. Like he didn't
Yeah.
balk when they said, "What's the two greatest commandments?" He said, "Hey, love God with all your heart, love other people." He didn't, no caveats to that. Like a lot of times
No.
we'll have caveats, especially if I refer to our greatest fan, which is the lady I'm married to. I have to be very careful. There's a lot of caveats because she'll listen to this on Tuesday and
Yeah.
there will be a review right afterwards, right? And, but then I also said, okay, so if it's internal, it could be external problems. And, because the goal of any hard conversation is restoration, right?
Yes.
It should be.
Yeah.
Should be. If you have to discipline your kids, it's to get them back on the tracks, right?
Yeah.
So what does that look like? And you got to know what right looks like. And by right, I'm going to lean real heavy into, scripture. Like, how does scripture tell us to do that? So hopefully
No.
that's a segue into your research.
No.
Uh,
No. It's you. As we're sticking on kind of that initial thought of why are these conversations hard? It's because you have to speak truth,
hmm
right? And we've talked about this so many times here on the podcast. In this day and age, you have so many places where people are trying to influence and trying to promote their sense of truth.
hmm
When, from a biblical standpoint, a truth is a person that is Jesus Christ, and there's no variable, there's no bending, right? It is a constant, it is fixed. And
Yeah.
so, if we really love someone and care about them, and I think I've used this example in a previous episode where I said, if you saw your neighbor's house on fire
hmm
and you didn't say something, what does that say more about you than what their house is on fire, right?
Yeah.
And we know people, to use that analogy, we have family, we have friends, we have coworkers, our community, right? And people say, well, I can't make an impact. Well, you can. You have a sphere of influence right around you. And
Yeah.
a lot of these people's lives are on fire,
Yeah.
right? They are pursuing things that they really shouldn't be pursuing. But you have to, one, build that trust.
Yeah.
Then you have to have a sense of love and that heart of trying to reconcile and then to speak the truth. Hey, drinking 5 bottles of Jack Daniels every day, which I think you could pull that off and still
That's great.
live,
Yeah.
but that's an extreme example. But you should speak up and say something to someone, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, man, like let's get you some help. It's not a
So,
judgment. It's just trying to help people, and I think that's the biggest thing is that love and compassion. And it's really about us growing too. As Christians,
mhm.
you're maturing, and as you mature, you try to help bring along people that are not quite where you're at.
So anchoring what you're about to say when you have those hard conversations.
Hmm.
I think you got to anchor it back to truth. And I love, so I'm in the book of Daniel. I love the book of Daniel. You and I've talked about this as we, drive in the mornings and stuff. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And this is when we talk about hard conversations. I love how God just like, hey, I got an example for you. By the way, it's right where you're studying. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, right? And he goes, hey, I had this really upsetting dream. I need you guys to tell me about it or I'm going to kill you. And, everybody else goes,
It's a technique.
I need you to tell me what that dream was. And he goes, and he just kind of like stops and he goes, if you can't tell me it, you're a fake and I'm going to kill you. Like he repeated, it's over. But
Yeah.
Daniel goes to sleep. He figures it out. He goes, hey, I'm going to go to sleep. God talks to him. And he comes back and talks to the king and he says, and he goes, okay, the king's like, tell me what he says. He goes, there is a God. And he anchors it right back
Yeah.
into that, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing as Daniel, who had a long tenure. I think it's Belshazzar. had the
That was
writing on
his.
his.
That was his name once he went to Babylon. Yeah.
Well, it was though. So okay, what's the other king? I'm trying to.
He served with Xerxes, I think. Right, was the last one. I think
Yeah, Cyrus.
Nebuchadnezzar
Uh huh.
and Cyrus, or think
Here it
something like that.
is. Yeah, and so here it is. Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and he even so kings appeal to Daniel. Um, there was another one that had the writing on the wall. Belshazzar was the guy, was the king. His
Okay.
name sounds a lot like it, though. I know what you're
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about, like
Yep. Yeah. Got you. Yeah.
Belteshazzar or something.
Yeah.
If you can pronounce that and you want to write in or tell us, that's awesome. I cannot.
Yeah.
I try, uh, but so he has the writing on the wall, and the queen's like, "Oh, I know a guy." And so he comes in. Daniel comes in, and he has to have a hard conversation. But he anchors it back in truth. And he says, I want you to know something. Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't, he felt like he was a little too proud too. This is what God did. And let me tell you where God is in your life right now.
Yeah.
It's about to be snatched from you. I think as we as Christians, as we as fathers, husbands, or even single moms out there and so forth, you're only how be a good way to put it? Your authority in a situation has to rest and anchor on truth, and Scripture is the truth. But like you said, it's a loving way, which is
Yeah.
tough. And if you, so I did a little research, Colby.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right, so here's the deal: when you get ready to have a hard conversation, and we started out and we said, hey, you got to love people enough to talk. You got to anchor it in the truth. But before, because I know you've got a lot of things about how we do this, I understand this. You're competing, whatever's going on, you're competing with other people's stuff, right? And you better pray for that opening and that time. I did a little research here, and it talked about, that people attend 25 million meetings per week. I feel like I have 24 of those million myself.
Yeah. I'm
But
right there with you.
yeah, so we probably have that covered. But and then you also have people with emails and so many hours spent on email, like 28 hours per week spent on email. And then you look at 92% of people are multitasking at any given time in their life. So you don't have the luxury to mess around when it comes time to talk, nor do you have the luxury to guide them in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's really simple, and I'll pull up a couple examples, but one that popped out to me was Luke 9:46-50 with the disciples.
Mhm.
And I'm sure the disciples are a lot. Any of us that's ever worked in a group or around a group of people, then you understand, like, sometimes there's just frictions. But there was the heart of this conversation was a little bit of pride, where the disciples like, who's going to be the greatest? Who's the greatest of us here? And Jesus kind of, in the way that he always does, he pulls an example. He grabs a little child and he says, if you can't come to me and welcome, yourselves and humble yourselves like a child, then you're not. The least is the greatest, right? This upside down kind of view of how greatness kind of works in the kingdom. But that was a hard conversation to have, to
Yeah.
tell people that, hey, you're missing the mark.
Yeah.
But often I feel like in our personal lives, we allow things to go for too long. We
Yeah.
allow situations, sin, to kind of get a good foothold in a person's life, and then we want to have, like in a class, an example is called what the intervention, right? That's what the
Mm-hmm.
world says. They wait till the person is kind of completely strung out on something, gather a bunch of people together, and then tell them it's wrong. Well, we're not doing anybody any favors by shying away from these conversations, and we
Yeah.
have them more often than we think. If you really just sit down and peel back those layers, we're having difficult conversations quite often. But if you prepare yourself, and we talked about this before, studying your word, spending time with God in prayer, then that discernment versus the judgment, right? What we talked about last week, you can
Yeah.
kind of see with a person like, hey, man, like I feel like something's going on. Let's talk about it. Let's get you some help. There's no judgment here. I just want to get you on the right track. But we can't shy away from it. We can't be too macho as guys, especially like, hey, man, um, I see you out here. You're married, but I see you doing some stuff that you shouldn't be doing, and I don't
Yeah.
want to say nothing,
You
right?
know, a lot of times so there's this psychological law almost, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is odd to say with psychology. Physics got laws, like
Mm-hmm.
gravity is a law. But there's this one, and they sum it up real well in Facing Giants when he says, you like to judge everybody on their actions and you on your intentions. So just like a professor told me one time, and it was a great statement. I was talking to him about something, and he goes, well, people are really just doing the best they can all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about that. And it was like the good Lord kind of laid it on my heart. It's right. Most people think they're doing right. Even if they know they're wrong, there is a, they believe their circumstances led them to that. Right.
Yeah.
And so how we deliver the heart of the message, I think is really important. I love the story of the woman at the well. I also don't think you need to deliver, if you're going to set the train back on the tracks, it's not between two positives. You know what I mean? Like it's not a
I've heard
sandwich.
like the sandwich thing. Yeah.
I hate
Yeah.
that. I almost prefer sometimes, and you got to know me. I'm like, hey, this is the standard. This isn't where you met the standard, but this is how you're going to get back on the standard.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty ideal. But I also think, man, you got to have a plan when you talk to people.
Yeah.
You got to
Yeah.
know the problem. You got to think about the cause of that problem. And then you got to give a possibility of hope.
Yeah.
And I think that last part's pretty key. A lot of times we just want to tell people, hey, man, you're messed up. Go figure it out. And that's wrong. They got to where they are.
Yeah.
So you got to help them. The woman at the well, though, talk about loving someone outside of the norm. She was a Samaritan.
Yeah.
The Samaritans stayed when the Assyrians, the brutal people, took everybody captive, right? Did you know that they would cross over the Jordan and go north? They wouldn't go through Samaria. They hated them.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a big, racial kind of divide between those two groups, like ethnic kind of divide. Like they would go out of their way not to go to Samaria.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a couple other kind of good examples along those lines of difficult kind of conversations and not shying away with big impacts that kind of want to highlight. One of my favorite people to study, if you ever listen to the podcast, and me and Jason talk about this person quite a bit, is King David.
Yeah.
Nathan confronting him.
Oh man.
Now, David was known for a lot of things, and one of them was, as Jason would say, was tearing it out of the frame. He was a warrior.
Yeah.
No doubt. And so coming to him, after he's committed adultery with Bathsheba, and this is from 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 14, if you want to go back and read it, he kills Uriah to cover his tracks.
Oh, man.
And so Nathan approaches him, and he uses a story about a man who stole, all this man had was a lamb, and a rich man steals it from him.
Yeah.
And David's, he's a righteous man. He's like, hey, who is it? I'm going to tear it out the frame. And then he tells him, bam, you did it.
You're it.
And thankfully, and this is why David has the title that none of us will ever hold, is the man after God's own heart, is he repentant. So it's a powerful story of having a conversation. You can't be afraid when the Lord is putting something before you. And I'm sure Nathan was a little terrified, rightfully so, but he did the right thing. The other one is Jesus and the rich young ruler. We covered this in a previous episode, Mark 10, 17 through 22. But here you see a man who, one, knew Jesus, knew the disciples, had heard the messages, and he was given an offer, and he turned it down because he had an attachment to something that wasn't the best for him. And we probably know a lot of examples out there, like with men and women and the folks in our circles, where they're doing something and Yeah, it's not necessarily bad. Having the wealth wasn't necessarily a problem, but
Yeah.
it's the attachment and what is manifesting in you that is a problem, right? And
Yeah.
so the young man left. And then lastly, Paul rebuking Peter,
Oh, man.
Galatians 2:11-14, where Paul had to confront Peter publicly for withdrawing from eating with the Gentile Christians
Mm-hmm.
because he got a little ashamed because of the Jewish believers telling him. And so
Yeah.
he had to rebuke a prominent. Now this is this is Peter. This is also the Peter that walked on the water. This is the Peter that cuts off ears. This is the Peter that curses. This is not an easy man to have probably conversations with.
He's probably got
And
a
he's
thick
now a
back.
church
Yeah.
right. And now he's a church leader, right?
Yeah.
So, but Paul, being Paul, he had boldness and he says, "Hey, we're going to stick to the truth of the gospel. Jesus came for who? For everyone.
Yeah.
And you can't just because your buddies over here don't like these people, you got to let that go, man." And I'm paraphrasing that conversation, but it wasn't an easy one. But we know conversations like that where you see people shying away from something because, like, oh, well, I run in this social circle or I'm a part of this group. And it's like, well, that doesn't mean anything, man. Like,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know?
I think, and you hit a nail on the head. Now we read that letter, right? But when you confront somebody with a problem and you're like, hey, I'm going to get this train back on the tracks, you got to do it private. If you embarrass people in front of people, they have to respond. The old saying is if you pull somebody's man card, they got to respond.
Yeah.
So, you admonish in private and things like that. But I also think about a guy who didn't have a chance to do things in private, and that was Moses.
Yeah.
If you don't think he had a hard conversation, that's you're out of your mind, right?
Yeah.
He said he didn't speak well, and he has to go before the Pharaoh and all these other things. But also, just like with Joshua, Jesus or God already had a conversation. I'm sure he had conversations with Joshua about be strong, be courageous. He calls you in there. God may have put you in that one spot.
Mm-hmm.
Ezra had the conversation. Not Ezra. The king, the female,
Esther?
Esther.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
She had to run the risk of getting her head cut off. And Mordecai tells her, says, "Hey, man, God put you here for a reason. Don't discount that.
Yeah.
You may be in somebody's life right now. You may be the only person that cares enough about them to share the gospel, to go, hey, I just want you to know the train's left the tracks. This is what you're doing. This is how we can correct it."
Yeah, I love
And,
that.
and that's the truth.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes, man, how they settle that up's between them and God and their conscience, because that's really what we're here for, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm bringing you to Jesus. You and Jesus are going to work out a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a great example of that, Jason. You're right. I think we too often want to feel like we have more power over eternal destinies than we do.
Yeah.
And the church corporately, right? I don't think we boil it down to our job is just to be obedient. And I think about Jonah, right? Jonah
Man.
did not want to go to Nineveh. He's like, I don't want to have this conversation. I hate them
Mm-hmm.
people. They can all just die.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I'm mad. I want you to kill them all. I'm gonna go the other way and get eaten by a fish.
And I'm willing to just go against God because I don't like these people this much. But it's like you said, like once Jonah came to his senses, and it took a while, right? And a lot of extra supernatural kind of things,
Mm-hmm.
it really still didn't boil down to Jonah's message converting people. Now, the largest revival one of the largest ever recorded in the Bible came out of Jonah's messages.
Yeah.
But each individual there had to make a choice.
Yep.
Jonah's job was to be obedient. Our job is to be obedient. Yeah. And if the Lord is putting on our hearts where we're at, in the jobs, the clubs, wherever you find yourself in your society and in your community, that's where you have that impact. And the Lord has you for a reason and a purpose. And it might just be to win one soul, to have one hard conversation that changes someone's eternal destiny. So you have to step up and do it.
Don't be self-righteous about it. God's righteous.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? A lot of times we get that, well, I'm just going to point my finger and I'm going to tell you how you're messing it up. It's always out of love. When you think about the confrontation of David and his sin, Nathan was a prophet. Last time I checked, I'm not one.
Yeah.
So that means you know what? I'm gonna stick to the loving example, and let's, because I love you. I want you to get back on the track. Even when I've had to discipline my son, I love him very much, or my daughter. I'm like, hey, I love you very much. The train has left the tracks. We've tried to talk it back on the tracks multiple times. So let's just have a reboot and let's move forward.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm going to tell you, when I was in Iraq, I was in Nineveh, which is Nineveh. I saw the capital of Assyria that's there. And they have a temple built to Jonah. When Jonah showed up, it's the original rocks that are there.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've been I spent some time there.
Right outside of Mosul, man. It's right there, right?
Well,
yeah. I was like, oh my goodness, it's there.
Well, I also got to see again, now we're nerding out war story time, right? The ziggurat of Abraham's supposed house, right? And that was neat. And then also Babylon, right? Down there and close to Halal, but the gates, the Ishtar gates, and all that kind of stuff. But anywho, another podcast for another day.
Podcast for another day. But it was amazing. Such a strengthening of the faith. I'm like, oh my goodness. But hard conversations. The Bible's full of where people have had to have those hard conversations. Yeah. And I really think about even when Jesus talked to the woman at the well, he was like, hey, he was steering her towards salvation. Yes, in all the conversations. It's always and he never, just like when she says, well, I ain't got a husband. He's like, you spoke pretty true on that. He didn't call her a liar. He's just like, I'm not calling you a liar. Just what you're saying is not true. But he lovingly is bringing her back into the fold. People who are doing wrong, man, they know it.
Yeah.
They know it.
Yeah.
They don't. Come on. If you love them enough to care, then you love them enough to talk. Yeah. Or, if you love them enough, that doesn't make any sense. So you can't edit that out. If you love them enough to care. If you care enough about them, then you should care enough to talk.
No, yeah, and I got you, and I think everybody did. But no, that's a good point to kind of put a bow on this episode. No, difficult conversations are just that. They're hard, but they're worth it. And I hope everyone kind of takes that away and explore some of those examples that we threw out today on the episode. Go back and encourage yourself, right? Hey, it can be done. And it usually leads to a really good impact if you follow through on that with love and with a little bit of understanding. So that's another episode of the Jonathan Project. So this episode will be out Tuesday
tomorrow morning
on Spotify. We have that fixed. So for all my Spotify fans, again, we apologize, but we have it up and running. Apple, iHeartRadio, you name it, you can find us. Again, if you want us to come out, speak to you at a men's event, church event, your business, whatever the case may be, please reach out to us at thejonathanprojectpodcast@gmail.com. Again, thejonathanprojectpodcast@gmail.com. Jason, always good to spend some time with you, talking about the Lord and just building up each other. And I hope there's no more breaks, mechanical issues.
Oh, man. I do too. I hope nothing breaks tonight. I'd really like to get some rest. But I do love the podcast, and I do. And I go back to, I gotta say this before we cut off here and you close it out, but the iron sharpening iron, right? Yeah. Like, that's a tough conversation. That's not just Bible studies. Like, that's some iron sharpening iron. Like, that's some rubbing some iron together to, hey man, but it's consistent and it's a lot. It takes a lot, right? And that's it. It's like washing with the water. So I got to throw that in there, especially considering iron sharpening iron, the Jonathan Project.
I appreciate it. All right, buddy. Talk to you again soon.
All right. See you, brother.